corruption and promoting economic development. The idealist-in-chief's record from his Indonesia days on human rights and democracy is even worse. Winters continues. In a LexisNexis search of every mention of Wolfowitz in the press during his years as ambassador, there is not one instance where he is quoted as speaking up on human rights or democracy in Indonesia. Instead, he is consistently apologetic for the Suharto regime, always turning the focus toward matters of business, investment, and the local and regional stability the iron-fisted Suharto helped promote. Wolfowitz not only intervened to undercut the Australian journalists who focused attention on a murderous and torturing American ally in Southeast Asia, but he lectured the Australians on how to handle an embarrassing flap. Play it down. Ignore it. His cowardly behavior prompted a rare rebuke from the head of the Australian government. Wolfowitz was specifically singled out for criticism by Australian Prime Minister Bob Hawke for his comments. Wolfowitz's candidacy for World Bank president immediately triggered criticism from rights activists in Indonesia. The head of Indonesia's state-sponsored National Human Rights Commission reported that of all former U.S. ambassadors, he was considered closest to and most influential with Suharto and his family, but he never showed interest in issues regarding democratization or respect of human rights, and never even visited the Commission's office. I also never heard him publicly mention corruption, not once, the Commission's head added. Other human rights and anti-corruption activists also said that they do not remember his speaking out against the abuses of the regime, and never felt Mr. Wolfowitz was on their side. They pointed out further that Wolfowitz remained a defender of the Suharto regime through the 1990s, well past the time when this world-class mass murderer, torturer, and robber had been overthrown from within. The record of Wolfowitz's passion for human rights and democracy goes back to his early days in Reagan's State Department and continues to the present, without notable change. Regional academic specialist Joseph Nevins writes that, throughout his tenure as ambassador and since, Wolfowitz consistently championed policies that undermine democracy and human rights in the sprawling archipelago, and supported the appalling atrocities carried out by the Indonesian Army, TNI, in occupied East Timor. In early 1999, Nevins writes, when it looked as if Indonesia might consider leaving East Timor, Wolfowitz argued against U.S. policies promoting such a scenario. Employing language long utilized by Jakarta, he predicted that if Indonesia were to withdraw, East Timor, due to tribal and clan-based tensions, would descend into civil war. Only the TNI had prevented such an outcome, according to Wolfowitz. At that time, the TNI was escalating its atrocities, and soon practically destroyed what little remained of the tortured country in a final paroxysm of violence. Human rights groups report continuing widespread military atrocities, Nevins continues, especially in Aceh and West Papua. Indonesian political and military leaders were absolved from responsibility in East Timor in fraudulent trials condemned by human rights organizations, but easily tolerated by Western participants in their crimes. Visiting Jakarta in January 2005, Wolfowitz called for increasing the U.S. military aid and training that have plagued Indonesians and others within the reach of the TNI for the past 40 years. The humanitarian guise of his mission was tsunami relief, Nevins writes, but its real significance lies in his effort to strengthen U.S. ties with Indonesia's brutal military, TNI, a role that he has long played. Bush and associates continued to pursue the president's democratizing mission in the traditional domains of U.S. power as well. In 2002, they supported a military coup to overthrow the elected government of Venezuela, headed by Hugo Chavez, but had to slink away in the face of overwhelming condemnation in Latin America, where democracy is not considered as quaint and obsolete as it is in Washington. After a popular uprising restored the government, Washington turned to subversion under the guise of supporting democracy, a familiar pattern. Thus, after decertifying Venezuela for alleged non-cooperation with U.S. drug operations in the region, Washington waived the cuts in U.S. foreign aid usually attached to decertification, so that it can continue to support Venezuelan pro-democracy groups that oppose the leftist Chavez. The concept is interesting. While Washington's right to support anti-Chavez groups in Venezuela cannot be questioned, there might perhaps be some eyebrows raised if Iran were funding anti-Bush groups in the United States, particularly if it did so right after having supported a military coup to overthrow the government. It is also apparently taken to be a logical impossibility that some groups supporting Chavez might be pro-democracy. That is proven by Washington's opposition to the government. Accordingly, it can have no relevance that Chavez has repeatedly won monitored elections and referenda, despite overwhelming and bitter media hostility, that his popularity ratings are at 80%, or that Latin America's major polling organization, Latino Barometro, found in 2004 that while satisfaction with democracy continues its ominous decline throughout Latin America, in striking parallel to the march of neoliberal programs that undermine functioning democracy, there were 3 exceptions. Leading the list was Venezuela, where support for democracy climbed from 64% to 74% between 1997 and 2004. The country now leads all countries in Latin America in support for its elected government. In contrast, most U.S. citizens believe the public has little influence on government decisions, and few believe that Congress will conform to the decisions the majority of Americans would make. U.S. citizens rank their own government below Britain, Sweden, Canada, and others, on the scale ranging from not democratic at all to completely democratic. Further proof of the anti-democratic character of Chavez supporters in Venezuela was his performance at the September 2005 UN summit, where he generated the loudest burst of applause for a world leader at the summit, with his unbridled attack on what he characterized as U.S. militarism and capitalism. This outlandish characterization of the United States as capitalist and militaristic reveals that he has taken on the mantle of the bad boy of UN summitry. Off the radar screen is what Americans can read in Ireland's leading journal by the veteran Latin American correspondent Hugh O'Shaughnessy, which helps explain the basis for the applause without resort to Bush-style wailing about how the world hates us because we are so good. In Venezuela, where an oil economy has over the decades produced a sparkling elite of super-rich, a quarter of under-15s go hungry, for instance, and 60% of people over 59 have no income at all. Less than a fifth of the population enjoys Social Security. Only now, under President Chavez, the former parachute colonel elected to office in 1998, has medicine started to become something of a reality for the poverty-stricken majority in the rich but deeply divided, virtually non-functioning society. Since he won power in democratic elections and began to transform the health and welfare sector, which catered so badly to the mass of the population, progress has been slow, but it has been perceptible, not least because Venezuela has joined with Cuba in a joint health strategy, which has brought perhaps 20,000 Cuban doctors and other health professionals here and spread them around the country from Caracas to remote spots where Venezuelan doctors refuse to serve. Operation Miracle is spreading the model to the Caribbean, with significant impact among the poor majority, it appears. In March 2004, concerned that elections in El Salvador might come out the wrong way, the democracy promotion missionaries warned that if Salvadorans made the wrong choice, the country's lifeline, remittances from the United States, a crucial pillar of the economic miracle.